Hi, Lindsey and Adrian. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
And we're here to talk about some of the deadliest diseases in history and the weirdest cures that we've come up with for them. And the reason why I'm so excited to get you guys down is because of this fantastic new book you've got out. So before we dive in with the questions, I was wondering if you could just introduce everyone to what Plague Busters is all about.
Yeah, well, I'm a medical historian, so I've been studying medical history for the last 20 years. And a lot of stories that would sort of form footnotes in academic research just lodge themselves in my imagination. And that was really a starting point for this children's book that we created called Plague Busters, which is about medicine's battles with history's deadliest diseases. And I think, Aid, you and I really wanted to set out to write the book that we would have loved as kids.
Yeah, absolutely. That's always the desire, is to try to do something that you think other people are going to enjoy, but you want to kind of think back to your own childhood, don't you, with a children's book, and think about the things that inspired you. And with me, like you, I think it was always the darker bits of history or macabre humor and stuff like that. So it basically, it's a book about terrible diseases and what people try to do to combat them.
There was so much when I read it that I'd never come across before, and it got me wondering, with a sort of project this vast, where do you begin with looking back to find all of these niche facts?
Like I said, I've been studying this for so long. There were a few stories that, I always wanted to tell in a bigger way. I think back to, the plague doctors certainly, are sort of the iconic imagery in this book as well. But again, it was really about picking, the diseases that we thought had done the most devastation in history, and the weirdest cures that doctors and medical practitioners leaned into during these earlier periods.
Yeah, the thing is, we picked, I think it's 6 diseases for the book, didn't we? And we could have chosen others, but I think you have to go for the ones that have the best stories behind them, really. It's all about story, isn't it, really?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, and you discover that there is so much out there. And I guess for both of you at this point, you must feel reasonably familiar with some of the worst diseases that we've come up against. If you had to live through one, which would be the one that you would choose, and which would be the one that you'd most want to avoid?
Well, I think Aid and I are going to have different answers here, but for me, it's always going to be smallpox. Just 1 teaspoon of the smallpox virus is enough to kill every man, woman, and child on the face of the earth. It was a terrible disease. It was really disfiguring as well. It is the only human disease that we've ever eradicated, which is incredible, an incredible accomplishment for medicine. But yeah, for me, it would always be smallpox.
And for me, it's scurvy, really. And the reason I'm both fascinated and appalled by scurvy is because I have a real fascination with maritime history. And of course, it affected sailors a lot through history. And it was, unlike a lot of the diseases in this book, like Black Death and smallpox, it would take weeks or sometimes months to kill you.
The response to these diseases, medicine has come a long way in recent years, but the whole theory of first do no harm wasn't necessarily always the case. So what were some of the most damaging cures that you kind of found in your research?
I think you have some really interesting takes on that.
The one that I find really quite bizarre is it's harmful to the point of actually killing people, which is a cure for rabies in the ancient world. Because rabies is basically, another word for rabies is hydrophobia, right? Which means fear of water, because people who get it, they can't face swallowing water. They're to the point where they're actually terrified of water coming near them. And that's why animals, drool and froth at the mouth when they've got rabies, because they can't swallow. So in the ancient world, the idea was, well, let's get water into these people somehow, right? So we hold them underwater, and then they'll take the water in, and while they're being held in the bottom of a pond or whatever, which was unfortunate because they didn't really distinguish the difference between swallowing water, taking it into the stomach, and taking it into the lungs and drowning. So, I suppose killing people by drowning was one way to cure rabies or cure a lot of other things.
Yeah, and also audience members should know that rabies is 100% fatal if left untreated. So I guess in a weird way, they were speeding things up. The inevitable was anyway.
In the most horrific
Yeah,
way.
in the most horrific way. For me, I always think of bloodletting is one of these kind of harmful practices in the past. It persisted into the 20th century. It's kind of like the equivalent of going to your doctor and asking for antibiotics. People requested to be bloodlet. And the idea in earlier periods was that if you got sick, there was an imbalance that had to be corrected. Perhaps you were producing too much blood, so they would release the blood in hope that that would cure you. And the first president of the United States, George Washington, fell ill with an upper respiratory biliary infection in the late 18th century. And he called for the bloodletters, and they came and they let so much blood out of George Washington that it hastened his death. Now, it's likely he probably would have died anyway, but it certainly didn't help letting all that blood out. So I always think of bloodletting. And if you see behind me, there's the barber's pole, which is also an old way that barber surgeons used to advertise their bloodletting services. They used to tie bloody rags around the pole, and it would swing around and create that spiral red and white pattern that we know today.
I love that that's an aesthetic we've tried to maintain, you know, remember the good old days of bloody rags on the streets. And so those are some great examples of some of the really deadly ones. But another thing I loved was some of the really like peculiar ones. I think there was one about eating crushed emeralds, which, I mean, sounds pretty fabulous as ineffective medicines goes. Were there any other really weird ones like that?
I think you love was it the Madstones you like particularly?
Yeah, that's right. Well, a lot of people, were unlikely to go to a hospital surgeon, to a doctor. That was very expensive. So they turned to these folk remedies. And one of my favorite is the Madstones. This became very popular in the mid-19th century in America. And they were like these big hairballs that were created in the guts of goats and deer, wasn't it? It was various animals.
Calcified, hardened hairballs.
Yeah, and people thought that they could draw out the rabies, the poison. And in fact, this was such a widespread belief that the president of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, took his son to be cured by a Madstone when he thought that his son had been bitten by an animal that was quite possibly rabid. Now, we know that his son didn't die from rabies, so the animal couldn't have been rabid, but, perhaps Lincoln thought that the Madstone had cured his son. This was a very prevalent belief in the 19th century.
Yeah, actually, while we're on, while we're on rabies, one of my favorite bizarre cures. This is in the Middle Ages. There was a monk called Albert the Great who thought that if you had a rabid dog, chances were you were going to get rabies, right? Because the dog was going to bite you. So best thing is to cure the dog of rabies. And he thought the best way to do this was to hang it upside down in a bath of water by its paws. And then after a while, you cut it down, you shave it, and then you rub it with beet juice. So what you end up with is a savage, naked, bright pink dog. So if the dog wasn't angry and going to bite you before all this, it sure as hell was going to do so afterwards. Right?
And there was another great example I remember reading about with the nutmeg, where it was kind of like, as you mentioned earlier, Lindsey, these guys were heading out with a plan to try and make people better. And we can only look now with the benefit of hindsight and see where they were going wrong and where they were going right. But ones like the nutmeg actually turned out did have some merit to it. So are there some examples that would have been surprisingly possibly effective?
You dug up a really weird one, didn't you?
About the red light.
Yeah.
There's a really good one to do with smallpox, which is it didn't actually cure smallpox, but it did have a vaguely beneficial effect. And the idea was that if you had smallpox, you should surround yourself with anything red. So, for instance, Queen Elizabeth I of England, when she had it, she was told, completely swaddle yourself in red cloth. And other people were supposed to sleep in red rooms with red drapes, eat red food, red light, surround yourself with red. Now, in the 19th century, there was I think he was a Danish scientist who discovered that red light actually can be beneficial in terms of helping stop the scarring that you get from smallpox. If the red light penetrates the skin enough, it will promote collagen, which, as with scurvy, is the stuff that holds us together. So it will stop the pustules from weeping and actually prevent the scarring. And in some respects, apparently, it can help with inflammation and can actually tackle some kind of bacteria as well. So purely by chance, in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, people doing this were actually having a beneficial effect on their patients without having a first clue why it worked. Yeah,
and I always think of the iconic plague doctor, which I actually happen to have a little plague doctor puppet. We picked this up in Venice years ago, and he said, "What are you going to do with that?" Now is the time for the plague doctor puppet. But it's hard to imagine coming out of COVID-19. People don't know the plague doctor. But if you aren't familiar, basically the plague doctor wore this beaked mask that you see here. And the idea behind it was that they thought disease was caused by something called miasma, which were like bad odors. And it's understandable because the slums and these overcrowded areas in earlier periods, they would have smelled very bad. They would have been very disease ridden. So the doctors thought the miasma was what was spreading the disease. So they wore these masks and they would put sweet smelling herbs into the bottom of the beaks. And then this would protect them from the miasma. And they would cover themselves. I mean, perhaps not in a fur. This is a very fancy plague doctor, but they would cover themselves sort of head to toe. They'd wear gloves. And in a way, you know, you have the cartoon in the book where the plague doctor is kind of giving the thumbs up to the guy in the hazmat suit. And so inadvertently, they were probably protecting themselves a bit for very different reasons to how we understand how diseases spread today, but nonetheless would have had a similar effect, I suppose.
It does make you feel quite grateful to be at the far end of the spectrum where now we've gained from all these learnings, but didn't have to go through the hard process of finding out. With your book as well, uroscopists, that was the first time I've ever come across this term.
We have another thing to show you.
Oh, fantastic.
Show and tell, but Adrian created a medieval urine wheel a while ago because we used to have a YouTube channel. So the idea behind this was doctors would take the patient's urine and then they would compare it to this color chart, and it would then reveal what they were suffering from. But really disgustingly, they also used to taste the urine. And what we discovered that was fascinating about this was that they were actually diagnosing things like diabetes because a patient's urine tasted sweeter. So yeah, the medieval urine wheel has come in handy as well.
Yeah, it's like a paint chart for PP, basically.
It is, yeah, the paint chart for PP. So we have all of that stuffed into Plague Busters, don't we? Every kind of weird fact and trivia. If you're one of those trivia, I always say that although this is for kids 8 to 12, I really hope that adults will like it too and learn about the past and the medical past and have fun reading it with their kids and their grandkids.
It's a book for all the family.
Yeah.
And so we've reflected on some of the more kind of disastrous examples of cures, but there have obviously also been some incredible success stories. So could you tell us a little bit about some of those?
Well, if I may.
I know where you're going.
I don't mean to go on about scurvy, but I'm damn well going to.
This is my life.
No, the thing about scurvy is that actually the problem was kind of solved quite early on in the mid-18th century by a really conscientious Scottish doctor called James Lind, who did a lot of it actually for the time, really scientific experiments as what would cure this. And he discovered after a long process of experiments that it would be citrus juice because it's a vitamin C deficiency, right? Now that's great, and that absolutely solved the issue from a scientific problem point of view. But just because you've solved the problem, it doesn't mean the problem is solved, if you see what I mean, because his work wasn't widely known. He published it, but the book wasn't widely distributed. So it took a lot of people, a lot of sort of people who are more public-minded than he was, better at getting the message out than he was, to actually get the message across. So it actually took probably another generation before anybody took up this idea. So what I love about medical history is you get these successes, but often the successes can still be flipped back into failures.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. In fact, we start Plague Busters with the story of a physician named Semmelweis, and there will be people out there who undoubtedly have heard of this man. I talk about him in my nonfiction book, The Butchering Art. And he was this surgeon and physician, and he was practicing in Austria in the 19th century. And he was putting together this idea that doctors were coming from the morgue, they were coming from the dead house onto the birthing wards, and these mothers were dying of high infection rates as a result. And so he guessed that they were carrying some kind of poisonous matter onto their hands. So he was trying to convince his colleagues to wash their hands, something that's really basic today that we know helps with hygiene in hospitals. And his colleagues just were not having it. They called him the hand washer, and he called them murderers. And it just sort of escalated from there until they put him into an insane asylum and he died. And so Semmelweis never got to see his own theories vindicated. And this is really the story of the history of science and medicine. It can be slow to change. And, you know, one of the lessons I think is that we always need to be open to those creative solutions to these problems. Even those things that seem kind of bizarre and out there can be proven after a long time to be true.
It's such a strange idea now to think of the hand washer ever being used as an insult. Now it's the bare minimum requirement.
I mean, I
feel like
why his colleagues got angry, because he was saying, you guys are murderers. You know, like it just seemed to kind of escalate and bounce back and forth between them. But yeah.
And also, it kind of goes back to what I was saying about James Lynn, is if you're not very good at getting your message over in an effective way, it can have a detrimental effect.
If you get angry and start calling your colleagues murderers, it's not going to work.
We've all got to stay calm. I feel like this question, in light of how many stories you guys have got, might be slightly unfair, but is it possible to pick a favorite fact from everything that you've learned for this book?
One of the things I did learn while researching and writing this book was about rabies. This was a disease I hadn't really dealt with in my adult nonfiction books or in my studies. And so I really delighted in finding stories about rabies. And like I said earlier, rabies is 100% fatal. I didn't know that if left untreated. And the other thing Adrian, I think, brought up was it was called hydrophobia. And when I was a little girl, my grandmother was raising me, and she would always warn me about hydrophobia. And I thought, what a strange, fear of water. What a weird thing to warn somebody about. And I always kind of made fun of her for it, because I said, hydrophobia. Well, now I know that this was a term for rabies.
One of my favourite facts actually is one that you told me about, which is about George Ray, who was one of the plague doctors in Edinburgh in the 17th century. And he was just one of a long line, because all of his predecessors had died of plague. So when the city elders go to him and say, we'd like you to be a plague doctor, they give him a huge fee, or would tell him they're going to give him a huge fee, because they have no expectation that he's actually going to make it through this thing, right? But he does. And then, unfortunately, he spends the next 10 years trying to collect his fee. So as a freelance cartoonist, I actually quite identify with that kind of thing.
Yeah, that guy never got his money.
Never got his money.
Terrible.
And everything that you've been writing about obviously takes us back in time to the history of plague and diseases. But the COVID-19 is kind of brought a lot of these lessons to the fore in reminding us about what plagues and pandemics can be like. What do you hope that we might learn from our most recent experience should another disease come around?
Well, it's always a good time to remind listeners we're not out of the pandemic yet. The start of pandemics are a medical decision, like the WHO decides we're in a pandemic. The end of pandemics tend to be a societal or government decision, a political decision. We all decide that it's okay to live with a certain level of risk. But, as a medical historian, I deal with the past and not the future. The one thing I can say with certainty is there will be future pandemics, hopefully not another major one in our lifetime, but there will be. And our only hope is to really, study the past and learn from the mistakes we made in the past. You have nothing to add to that.
You're the medical historian, so
it's like,
what am I going to tell you?
What am I going to say? I'm a medical historian.
We'll get some great political cartoons out of there.
That's good. I like that alternative angle.
He actually did a very funny cartoon when we were in lockdown over here in Britain.
There was, when he was still Prince Charles, King Charles got COVID, and I did a little cartoon with him. Sort of the idea was the COVID virus. The spikes that come off the virus. I did them all as little hands, and he's shaking hands with the virus and saying, "And what do you do?"
Yeah, and you actually took that onto stage, then, because you were working on Spitting Image, the revival of the show here.
We actually made that
personification
virus. We made that virus into a puppet, so that was great fun.
And you're both extremely established in your own skill sets. So obviously, Lindsey, you're a medical historian, and Adrian, you're art and puppet making. What was it like? Have you worked together on a project like this before?
Well, we've worked on projects, but never paid.
No.
But we worked on my YouTube series Under the Knife for a while, and you're always my first port of call. When I write my nonfiction, he always is reading drafts of it and giving feedback on it. You're always the first person to read, and you're the last person before it goes into production. Yeah. And so I think, I'm not very helpful to you with the drawing.
Well, you say that, but equally, if I've done a caricature of someone and I need a verdict on it, Lindsey's there, so Lindsey's going to be the first person. Is this okay? Does this look all right? Does this look like who it's supposed to be?
He loves ruining faces for me. I'll say, I'll point to a handsome actor and I'll say, what is it about that man's face? And he'll instantly, he'll say like, oh, the eyes are too far apart, or and then he'll do a quick sketch, and then that's all I can see. But you always
ruining faces since 1980. Yeah,
ruining faces. But you've said too that being a caricaturist isn't really about making fun of people. It's about making them look more like themselves than they are.
There's an element of making fun of people, of course there is, but also you talk to any caricaturist, and I think they'll tell you they do it because they love faces, and all portraiture to some extent is exaggeration. So caricature is a nice way to sort of take portraiture to its illogical conclusion. And actually, for this book, because I am a caricaturist, for this book, it was very nice to get some caricature into it, because there's a lot of famous names in the book from the past, some of which people will be familiar with. Like, everybody has a vague idea of what William Shakespeare looked like, with the bald head and the pointy beard or whatever. But Edgar Allan, actually, Edgar Allan Poe's in the book. That's a painting of Edgar Allan Poe. But there are some that aren't necessarily as well known. So it's nice to give them a face and give them some character through caricature.
Yeah.
And that's what I really enjoy.
And you loved doing the Andrew Jackson illustration.
Yeah, that's actually one of my favorite illustrations in the book, which is the Andrew Jackson caricature, because he was one of the presidents of the US. He's on the $20 bill. And if you actually look at him on the $20 bill, he's got this wonderful wild hair and slightly wild eyes. And he was notorious for fighting duels and being a generally kind of belligerent kind of guy. So I did him literally armed to the teeth, where he's got cross belts on with pistols sort of stuck in the crossbelt, and he's holding two pistols. He's got a cutlass between his teeth. He's got a sword at his side. So he's a great character. So it's nice to bring out someone's character through caricature.
Yeah, and I loved the cover. I don't know if we can hold it up so people can see, but the cover featuring the plague doctor. And actually, that's me. I had to pose as the plague doctor for reference. And I had to do this 3 days after I was diagnosed with breast cancer last year. I'm totally fine. I've come through it. I caught it very early. And just PSA, get your mammograms. But the show didn't stop in the house, did it? We had to kind of push forward. And so we were really working on this book while I was going through treatment, and the medical historian becoming the patient gave it a whole other twist for me. Definitely. But the plague doctor, you got me this like monk's outfit from Amazon, and I had to pose and wear this. And then we had the dancing plague rats at the bottom.
Didn't do that.
No, we didn't have we didn't recreate the rats at the bottom. But it was funny process going through that, because our publisher, our original concept, they rejected because they thought it was too fantastical. But dancing plague rats seemed to be okay. Yeah. So it was weird, trying to communicate all this to a younger audience. For me, I've always dealt with adult audiences. I joke that I've terrified adults for the last 10 years. I'm coming for your kids now, and sharing my passion for medical history with them.
Yeah, going back to the illustrations just quickly, I did want to bring up the Dr. Gutsmuth's, is that how you pronounce it? The safety coffin?
Gootsmoot. I think it's Gootsmoot.
I don't know. That's all on you. Yeah. I'm bad at pronouncing names.
That was a real highlight. We've been talking a lot about the sausage tube. Could you just introduce that for people who are listening?
Well, it was just taking what was at the time probably a really silly idea and making it even sillier. And the idea was a safety coffin, and the idea was that people were terrified. I think it was because of cholera.
Cholera, yeah.
People were terrified of being buried alive. So they came up with these ideas for safety coffins, where if they had been buried alive, they could tell the world about it, or they could survive for a decent period of time. So this Gootsmoot guy came up with this idea of a safety coffin where it'd have a feeding tube and a breathing tube as well. So he demonstrated it to the world by having food pushed down this tube, and that included sausages and beer and soup. Yeah. So basically, we've got him lying on his back in the coffin with the feeding tube, and there's a big funnel, and somebody's just stuffed a barrel of beer in it and a whole string of sausages. So,
and I have to say that the safety coffins, there's no records that say that they actually worked, that anybody was saved by the safety coffin. They also, a lot of people, listeners and viewers will remember the idea of the bell. So they would tie around the corpse's wrist this string, and there would be a bell at the top of the grave. And if the person was buried alive, if suddenly woke up and found themselves 6 feet under, they could start ringing the bell. But the problem was that as a body begins to decompose, it moves anyway down there. So the bells would go off, and it was a really unhelpful little mechanism. And I think there's still a few bells in cemeteries if you look hard enough. There is this misconception that the term "saved by the bell" comes from that, but that's actually an old boxing term, I believe, isn't it? Saved by the bell. Yeah. But yes, they tried all kinds of things, and it was because cholera manifests itself in the final stages. You look pretty much dead. There's this sort of paralysis, and there's this,
but you aren't
necessarily dead. And so, yeah, there was this real fear in the 19th century because of the prevalence of cholera, that people could be buried alive.
So did that thing you were saying about decomposition making them move and they rang the bell, did that mean people got dug up thinking they were alive and then they weren't?
Yeah, absolutely. And then people, I guess the living were like, this isn't working. We keep picking up these dead bodies. But, you know, Edgar Allan Poe, you know, he was obsessed with this idea of premature burial. Everybody was really afraid of it.
Stories about it, didn't he?
So these have been some fantastic stories, but we've still only really just skimmed the surface of Plague Busters. Could you just give people an idea of what else they could expect from the book?
Well, really just the grisly, weird facts about medical history. You know, again, I have to say this was the book we wrote that we would have loved as kids. We think adults are going to love it. If you don't like history, you might like this book because medical history is very relatable. Everybody knows what it's like to be sick, especially in the age of COVID. And so in that way, I think, you know, you can open this book and you can feel for the people who went through these experiences and feel for the patients as well. And the doctors who went, you know, into these operating theaters, for instance, time and again, trying to save their patient's life and failing. And it must have been a real, you know, upsetting experience on some level. And I also just want to say, speaking of failure, because we haven't actually announced this yet, but I'd love to tell people we're doing a second children's book, and it's going to be called Dead Ends, and it's all about medicine's failure and the weird things that people did in the past that just kind of failed bombastically. And we're really looking forward to talking to audiences about that as well.
That'll be good fun. But I mean, the thing with Plague Busters for me, it's that I think there's a message of hope in it, really. And it's called Plague Busters, right? It's about the people that were actually trying to sort these terrible problems out. And that's the message of hope, really, is that however bad the world gets, however much disease there is around, there are always people trying to help. They might not get it right the first time round, but eventually someone will solve the problem. So, you know, I think it's dark and light, really. Hopefully a bit more light than dark, right?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I think it's a great balance, and really excited to hear about the second book. We'll look out for that. Where can people go now if they want to check out more of your work, both in the medical history and the illustrations?
Well, actually, at the moment, for a limited time only, you can see my work on stage because Spitting Image is now a stage musical in the West End of London. And I designed most of the puppets for that. So you can see the puppet versions of, you know, Boris Johnson.
Yeah, Tom Cruise. Tom Cruise is very small, which I really love. Tiny Tom Cruise.
A host of celebrities.
Ian McKellen.
Ian McKellen's there.
Great.
Just a host of famous names really on stage as puppets. So that's where you can see my stuff. And of course, you know, you can find my stuff online on social media and such, like Teal cartoons. So.
Yeah, and same with me. I'm kind of everywhere. There's a bit of oversaturation of medical history from Lindsey Fitzharris. But if you are an adult listener and you're interested in medical history, I have a book called The Butchering Art Out, which is about Victorian surgery and Joseph Lister of Listerine fame. And my last book, The Facemaker, is about a pioneering surgeon named Harold Gillies who rebuilt soldiers' faces during the First World War. It's a real epic war story about a genuine miracle worker.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for that chat. I had a lot of fun. It was really great meeting you both, and hopefully we'll get to speak again soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us on.
Thank you very much.